Fallacies are problems in logical arguments that make a philosophical argument not work, or in other words, be what is called invalid. The particular fallacies that we will be discussing today are called informal fallacies because they are commonly found in everyday conversation. They are useful to understand because they allow us to make sure our own arguments are logical and persuasive, and they allow us to criticize flaws in the arguments of other people, such as philosophers, journalists, other students, and politicians, for example. However, merely identifying a fallacy doesn't end the debate or discussion. Instead, it opens up an avenue for more discussion, both to ensure that a fallacy really has been committed and to clarify the arguments and thinking that both we present and are presented by others. The first informal fallacy we will learn about is called the ad hominem fallacy, which is a Latin phrase that means to the person or against the person. It occurs when a person attacks his or her opponent directly instead of their argument. In politics, this is often referred to as mudslinging. For example, if the poet Allen Ginsberg's argument in favor of marijuana legalization is being discussed, and the opponent claims that Ginsberg's arguments are irrelevant because he's nothing more than a homosexual pot-smoking hippie, the ad hominem fallacy has been committed. The reason why is because the opponent has not addressed whatever reasonable arguments Ginsberg may have presented in favor of the legalization of recreational marijuana use, and instead has attacked Ginsberg personally. Therefore, this is an example of an ad hominem fallacy. The next fallacy we will discuss is called the appeal to force fallacy. This fallacy occurs when one arguer either actively or by threats resorts to violence instead of clear, reasoned argument. An example would be if two children are arguing on the playground and one says to the other, "Power Rangers is the best show on TV. If you don't agree with me, I'll punch you in the mouth." The child has not logically proven that his favored TV show is the best, instead merely threatened to beat up the other child if he doesn't agree. At the largest historical level, it may in fact be the case that all human warfare is an enormous example of the appeal to force fallacy writ large. Whether or not one person is physically capable of committing violence on another person is no indication of who has the more persuasive, logical, and rational argument. The straw man fallacy occurs when one arguer distorts the argument of his opponent for the ease of attacking it, setting up a straw man, like a scarecrow or dummy version of the argument, which is a mischaracterization of the argument and therefore incapable of being defended. A relevant example comes from the congressional record of the legislature of Louisiana. In this example, a legislator argues, quote, "Whereas the writings of Charles Darwin, the father of evolution, promoted the justification of racism, and his books on the origin of species and the descent of man postulate a hierarchy of superior and inferior races, therefore be it resolved that the legislature of Louisiana does hereby deplore all instances and all ideologies of racism, does hereby reject the core concepts of Darwinist ideology that certain races and classes of humans are inherently superior to others, and does hereby condemn the extent to which these philosophies have been used to justify and approve racist practices." In this example, the arguer has reduced evolutionary theory to nothing more than simple racism, creating a caricature of evolution by oversimplifying it and misclassifying it. The argument then runs, racism is bad, evolutionary theory is nothing more than racism, therefore evolution is bad and should not be taught. The fallacy is that this is a misrepresentation of evolutionary theory. Evolution has been used for racist purposes in history. However, that provides no indication of the likely accuracy or inaccuracy of evolution as a scientific theory. Racism is easy to reject, however. Because evolutionary theory really is more than simple racism, this argument commits the straw man fallacy. Next in our discussion is the Red Herring Fallacy. This fallacy occurs when the arguer changes the subject in order to distract the attention of the audience. The fallacy gets its name originally from the practice of fox hunting, in which a dog trainer would try and trick trained bloodhounds from a fox scent by dragging a smelly bag of red fish, or herrings, across the trail the dogs otherwise are supposed to follow. If the dogs are distracted and wind up at the smelly fish, they've been misled from the appropriate conclusion they should have reached. An example would be as follows. A school board committee member argues, quote, "The school board argues that our schools are in desperate need of repair, but the real reason our students are falling behind is that they spend too much time with their computers. Becoming educated means a lot more than learning how to point and click. The school board should send a letter to the parents urging them to monitor their kids' computer time. Did you notice the element of distraction? The much more obvious conclusion would likely be that the school needs repair. However, this arguer likely does not want to spend the money required for repair, and so changes the subject to the topic of discipline in order to achieve better academic results. Nice and cheap discipline. Another example in a political context might be the discussion regarding how to craft policy to combat climate change, when the red herring jobs is introduced as a distraction. In this case, as in all of these cases, both judgment and ability to argue that a fallacy has been committed convincingly are required. Perhaps the effect of climate regulations on jobs is not a fallacy. That would be the issue which would have to be debated in order to determine if it really is fallacious, meaning that an illogical fallacy of inappropriate distraction has been committed, or if it is a relevant counter-argument. Lastly, the fallacy of appeal to authority, or more specifically, the appeal to unqualified authority, or the unqualified appeal to authority. The example I've provided on the PowerPoint slide is, quote, "My pastor said that global warming isn't caused by humans, therefore humans did not cause global warming." Unless the pastor is also a trained meteorological scientist, there is not much reason to be persuaded by his argument. Similar, one would not ask the local weatherman about deep theological and spiritual matters. In either case, we must be sure that we are dealing with appropriate experts in the relevant field. Otherwise, they are not a qualified authority or expert, worthy of being presented as a persuasive source. Importantly, this is exactly why appeals to sacred scriptural text must be carefully handled. There may be a desire to use a religious text as an authority. However, unless the audience also agrees that the text is authoritative, the argument likely commits the unqualified appeal to authority fallacy. For example, if a Christian tries to convince a non-Christian that abortion is morally wrong because the Bible identifies it as wrong, the argument is not likely to be persuasive. In the same way, a person that argues that pork should not be eaten because it's forbidden by the Quran would likely be appropriately classified as an unqualified appeal to authority unless both the arguer and his or her audience considers the Quran as an authoritative and appropriately relevant moral guide.